They say every legend starts with a whisper, and in the case of Virginia Hill, that whisper came from the dusty back roads of a small Alabama town. The year was 1916, and the world was still stitched together by horse-drawn wagons and whispered promises. Virginia was born into a family that knew more about struggle than success. Her father worked hard but never seemed to get ahead, while her mother kept the house warm with little more than determination and a sharp tongue. Even as a child, Virginia looked around and saw a world that didn't seem fair. A world where charm and ambition could buy you more than sweat ever could. By the time she turned 15, Virginia had already learned how to read people, not just their words, but their eyes, their posture, the small hesitations that revealed who had power and who was pretending. She wasn't like the other girls who dreamed of quiet lives or steady husbands. Virginia wanted more: silk dresses, flashing lights, the kind of life that made people stop and stare. And deep down, she knew she'd never find it in the sleepy streets of Marietta, Alabama. When she ran away to Chicago, it wasn't out of rebellion. It was out of hunger. The hunger for a bigger life, the kind of hunger that doesn't let you sleep at night. Chicago in the 1930s was a city alive with smoke and sin, jazz clubs that pulsed like beating hearts, and men who spoke in soft voices but ruled with iron fists. It was a city built on deals made in shadows, where beauty and danger often shared the same bed. Virginia found work as a waitress in one of those smoke-filled clubs, serving bootleg whiskey to men in pinstripe suits who smelled of money and murder. She didn't belong to their world yet, but she could feel it pulling her closer, like a moth circling a flame. The gangsters noticed her too, not just for her looks, but for her sharpness. She listened more than she talked. She remembered names, habits, and secrets. And in a city where secrets could be traded like gold, that made her valuable. She learned how to walk like she owned the room, a trick she picked up from watching the wives and mistresses of mobsters glide across the floor. She wasn't content to be background noise. She wanted to be seen, respected, feared even. And soon enough, she was. Rumor has it that her first connection to the underworld came through one of Al Capone's lieutenants, a man who saw in her the same thing everyone eventually did: potential wrapped in danger. Virginia wasn't a killer or a thief, but she was something rarer. She was adaptable. She could play the innocent girl, the sharp-tongued woman, or the loyal companion, depending on what the moment required. She learned early that power wasn't just about muscle or bullets. It was about access, and she was determined to gain it. By her early 20s, Virginia was no longer the naive Southern girl who had stepped off the train in Chicago. She had reinvented herself into a woman who understood the game and played it better than most men. Her beauty opened doors, but it was her intelligence that kept them open. She had a talent for being in the right place at the right time, a witness to deals, affairs, and betrayals that most people only whispered about. She became known as the Queen of the Nightclubs, a woman who could charm a room full of gangsters and walk out with information that could topple empires. To some, she was just a socialite floating between men of power. To others, she was something far more dangerous, a woman who knew too much. Yet despite the chaos around her, Virginia had her own set of rules. She wasn't reckless with her alliances. She never gave herself completely to anyone, not even the men who swore they'd protect her. Deep down, she knew that love in the mob was a temporary arrangement, one that often ended in blood or betrayal. She wasn't going to be another name forgotten in a newspaper headline, but even Virginia couldn't deny the thrill that came with proximity to danger. The luxury, the attention, the intoxicating feeling of walking through life with powerful men at her side. It was everything she had once dreamed of. And yet there was always that lingering shadow, that quiet voice reminding her that in this world, nothing came free. It was around this time that she met a man who would change her life, not because of romance, but because he opened the final door she'd been waiting for. His name was Joe Epstein, a mob bookkeeper known for keeping the ledgers clean and the bosses richer. Joe saw something in Virginia, the same combination of charm and cunning that made her irresistible to dangerous men. He brought her into the circles that operated behind the glitz, the places where money flowed like rivers, and death was just another transaction. Through Epstein, she met the heavyweights, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and most fatefully, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. But that's another chapter of her story. For now, she was still the rising star, the Southern girl who clawed her way into the heart of the American underworld. In those early years, Virginia built her reputation the way others built empires, one connection at a time. She could keep her mouth shut when it mattered most, and in a business built on lies, that made her priceless. Men trusted her with their secrets because she made them feel safe. Little did they know, she was collecting those secrets like pearls, stringing them together into something only she fully understood. But every secret comes with a price. And for Virginia, that price would grow heavier with every passing year. Behind the laughter, the champagne, and the soft glow of nightclub lights, there was a woman who could never truly rest. She was playing a game where one wrong move could end everything. Still, she didn't flinch, because deep down she believed she could outsmart them all. She believed she was untouchable, and for a while she was right. The mob might have had its kings, but Virginia Hill was about to prove that even in a man's world, the queen could still make the most powerful moves. Before long, her name would be whispered in the same breath as the most notorious gangsters of her time. But for now, in the smoky glow of Chicago's underworld, she was still rising, a scarlet flame flickering against the darkness, unaware of how high and how far she was about to fall. It was the beginning of a story drenched in glamour, greed, and danger. The kind of story that reminds us, the American dream doesn't always come wrapped in innocence. Sometimes it comes wearing red lipstick and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. And for Virginia Hill, the girl who ran from poverty and found herself at the heart of organized crime, that was exactly how her legend began. By the mid-1930s, Virginia Hill was no longer just a pretty face serving drinks to gangsters. She was an insider, a trusted companion, and in many ways, a player in her own right. The Chicago underworld had a rhythm, a pulse that beat beneath the city's lights, and Virginia had learned to move with it. She danced between danger and desire with the grace of someone who knew the cost of missteps. And yet, she made it look effortless. Her introduction to the mafia's inner circles didn't happen overnight. It was a slow seduction, not of romance but of trust. Joe Epstein, the mob bookkeeper who first took her under his wing, taught her that numbers told stories more powerful than any confession. Virginia would sit quietly in his office, pretending not to listen, while men discussed shipments, payoffs, and laundering schemes that stretched from Chicago to New York. She remembered every name, every location, every coded word. Epstein once told her, "Knowledge is better than money. They can take money away, but if you know where it's buried, that makes you valuable." Virginia never forgot that. She became the quiet observer, the one who smiled when others talked, who nodded when asked nothing, and who walked away with more understanding than the men who underestimated her. It was during one of Epstein's social gatherings that Virginia first crossed paths with Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he carried himself like someone who didn't need to be. Luciano had already carved out his place as one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, and his presence was magnetic. Virginia, with her sharp wit and fearless gaze, didn't shrink beneath it. When Luciano spoke to her that night, it wasn't the conversation of a mob boss and a party girl. It was something else. He saw in her a different kind of weapon, one that didn't fire bullets but could still kill reputations, ruin alliances, and gather intelligence without anyone noticing. Before long, she was running errands that seemed harmless on the surface, delivering envelopes, escorting guests, traveling between cities with information wrapped in coded language. But these weren't the errands of a secretary. They were the tasks of someone trusted to move between worlds, the legitimate and the illicit, without leaving footprints. Virginia became the mob's unofficial courier. She could walk into a politician's office, a casino lobby, or a hotel suite full of federal agents, and no one would suspect her of being anything other than a glamorous woman enjoying the high life. That was her gift, invisibility wrapped in allure. Her travels took her to Miami, Havana, and eventually Los Angeles, each city teaching her something new about the men who ran America's shadow empire. She dined with gangsters, politicians, and movie stars, slipping between them like smoke. And in every room she learned how power was traded, not with guns but with favors. But it wasn't until she met Benjamin Bugsy Siegel that her life truly took a dangerous turn. Bugsy wasn't like the others. He was charming, reckless, and utterly intoxicating. Where Luciano was calculating, Siegel was wild, a storm in a tailored suit. The two collided like sparks in dry grass. Their chemistry was instant, electric, and doomed. Virginia and Bugsy became inseparable, lovers, partners, and, in many ways, equals. Together, they were the talk of every city they touched. He was the handsome gangster with movie star looks. She was the fiery southern beauty who could drink with the boys and outwit them all. Their relationship was a headline waiting to happen, and the underworld took notice. To many, Virginia was just Bugsy's girl. But behind the scenes, she was far more than that. She handled money, made introductions, and helped smooth over tensions between rival factions. When Bugsy wanted to impress investors for his grand dream, the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, it was Virginia who worked the social circles, who whispered in the right ears, who made sure the right men felt respected. She wasn't just the girlfriend. She was the fixer, the diplomat in designer heels. But being close to Bugsy meant inheriting his enemies. He had a temper that could shatter glass, and a mouth that got him into more trouble than his gun could get him out of. Virginia saw the cracks forming even as she tried to hold things together. Late at night, in hotel suites filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey, they would argue about money, loyalty, and survival. She loved him, but she wasn't blind. She could see the danger building around him, and by extension, around her. Still, she stayed. Maybe it was love, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was that same hunger that had driven her from Alabama to Chicago. She wasn't going to walk away from the empire she'd helped build. By the early 1940s, Virginia Hill was more than just a name in mob gossip. She was a symbol. To the FBI, she was the mysterious woman who appeared in too many photographs with too many criminals. To the newspapers, she was the mob's mistress. To the men in power, she was both a risk and a resource. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really knew her. She played her part perfectly. In public, she was elegant and untouchable, attending Hollywood parties, posing for photographs, and mingling with celebrities. In private, she was the keeper of secrets, a living archive of organized crime's most sensitive dealings. She knew who paid off which officials, which casinos were fronts, and which shipments never made it to the docks. And through it all, she never wrote anything down. Her memory was her greatest weapon, and her greatest curse. One night in Los Angeles, after another one of Bugsy's blow-ups over money gone missing, she sat by the window of their hotel suite, staring out at the city lights. She thought about all the men she'd met, the killers, the dreamers, the kings of the underworld, and wondered if any of them ever truly felt safe. Probably not, but safety was never what she wanted. She wanted control, and in her own way, she had it. The mafia had their soldiers and their capos, but Virginia was something else. A phantom who could glide through the cracks of power. She could deliver a message across states faster than a wire, and no one would suspect her. She could attend a dinner with mob bosses and FBI informants in the same week and keep both sides guessing. Still, every empire built on deception has a breaking point. The more powerful she became, the more eyes turned toward her. The FBI began keeping tabs, snapping photos, listening in on conversations. The newspapers started writing her name more often, connecting her to Siegel, to Luciano, to Epstein. And with every article, her invisibility faded. Virginia knew what that meant. The higher you climbed in the mob, the thinner the air became, and the harder it was to breathe. But even as the storm clouds gathered, she didn't back down. When asked once if she was afraid of the men she worked with, she laughed and said, "They're the ones who should be afraid of me." And in that moment, she meant it. Because by then, Virginia Hill wasn't just a girl from Alabama who got lucky. She was a force, a woman who had infiltrated the most dangerous organization in America and lived to tell the tale. She was still dancing with devils, and for now the devils were dancing to her tune. But in the world of organized crime, every dance eventually ends. And when it does, the music stops with a gunshot, and somewhere deep down, Virginia already knew her song was running out of time. By the mid-1940s, Virginia Hill had become a legend wrapped in silk and smoke. She wasn't just a mob mistress anymore. She was the woman everyone whispered about in speakeasies, gambling dens and smoky backrooms from Chicago to Beverly Hills. To the men who ran the underworld, she was both muse and menace. To the FBI, she was a walking enigma, too smart to corner, too clean to charge. But to those who truly knew her, Virginia wasn't a mystery at all. She was ambition given a woman's face. Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo project in Las Vegas was her masterpiece, or so she thought. When the mob dreamed of transforming a dusty desert into a playground for the rich and reckless, Bugsy wanted to be its king, and Virginia by his side wanted to be its queen. She threw herself into that dream with a passion that blurred into madness. Every detail of the Flamingo carried her touch, the glamorous decor, the imported linens, even the entertainment lineup. To her, it wasn't just a casino. It was their ticket to immortality, but behind the elegance lay chaos. Money was leaking like water through cracked glass, and Bugsy's temper grew worse by the day. The bosses in New York, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, were losing patience. Rumors swirled that Bugsy was skimming profits, that Virginia was hiding funds overseas, that someone would soon pay the price. Virginia didn't scare easily, but even she could feel the tension closing in like a noose. She tried to hold Bugsy together, reminding him that the Flamingo could still succeed if he stayed calm. But Bugsy was a man consumed by ego and paranoia. He'd scream one moment, kiss her the next, and vanish into the night chasing debts that couldn't be collected. The cracks in their empire deepened. FBI agents followed Virginia's movements, curious why this society girl seemed to be everywhere money changed hands. Newspapers started printing her name alongside Siegel's, branding her the mob's Red Queen. She wore that title like armor, pretending it didn't sting. But late at night, when the parties ended and the champagne glasses sat empty, she'd sit in silence, watching the desert wind sweep across the unfinished casino grounds. That's when the doubts crept in. She wasn't naive. She knew how the mob handled failure. She'd seen it before, and Bugsy, as much as she loved him, was making enemies faster than he was making money. Then came the night of June 20th, 1947. Bugsy Siegel was in Los Angeles, lounging in the Beverly Hills home they once shared. Virginia wasn't there. She had left for Europe days earlier, supposedly on business. Around midnight, shots rang out. 9 bullets tore through the window, ending Bugsy's life in an instant. News spread like wildfire. The Flamingo's king was dead, and all eyes turned to his queen. Reporters painted her as the femme fatale who'd betrayed him, the siren who'd lured him to his doom. Some claimed she'd fled with mob money. Others whispered that she'd warned Bugsy's enemies of his every move. The truth was murkier. Virginia never spoke publicly about that night. All anyone knew was that she never returned to Los Angeles. In Italy, she lived like a ghost, rich, beautiful, and dangerous to know. She kept company with diplomats, businessmen, and exiles from the old American mob. Some said she was laundering money for the syndicate. Others believed she was on the run from it. Either way, she didn't stop moving. Paris, Rome, Zurich, each city became another mask, another chapter in a life that refused to slow down. But no matter how far she went, America wouldn't forget her. The FBI followed her trail across continents, convinced she was hiding millions of mob dollars in European banks. In 1951, when the U.S. Senate opened the Kefauver hearings to expose organized crime, Virginia Hill's name appeared on the witness list. The Queen of Secrets was being summoned home. Her arrival in Washington was a spectacle. Cameras flashed as she strutted up the Capitol steps in a fur coat, unbothered and unapologetic. Senators expected a frightened woman, maybe even a broken one. What they got was pure defiance. When asked how she made her living, she smirked and said, "I just get gifts from my friends." The committee pressed harder. They wanted names, bank accounts, details about her role in the syndicate. Virginia gave them nothing but charm and sarcasm. "I'm not a gangster," she told them. "I'm just a woman who knows how to get along." The public loved her nerve. The mob loved her silence. And the government, well, they hated her even more for it. When she walked out of that hearing room, she wasn't just a figure in Bugsy Siegel's shadow anymore. She was her own myth, part movie star, part criminal icon, untouchable and unforgettable. But even legends have limits. In the years that followed, the glamour began to fade. Without Bugsy, her connections weakened. The mob had moved on to new ventures and new faces. Virginia was still beautiful, still charming, but her world was shrinking. The same men who once protected her now saw her as a liability, a woman who knew too much and no longer had anyone to shield her. She started drinking more, drifting through Europe like a restless spirit. The luxury hotels and lavish parties gave way to smaller apartments, quieter company. And with every passing year, the ghosts grew louder. Bugsy's death, the lies, the money that was never truly hers. By the early 1960s, she was living in Salzburg, Austria. The once feared queen of secrets had become a recluse. Neighbors described her as polite but distant, a woman who smiled rarely and drank often. No one really knew what she was running from anymore. Maybe it was the law. Maybe it was her past. Maybe it was herself. One cold day in March 1966, a maid found her body in the snow outside her villa. The cause of death was ruled a suicide, an overdose of barbiturates. But the rumors never stopped. Some said the mob had silenced her before she could talk. Others believed she'd simply run out of reasons to keep living. Whatever the truth, Virginia Hill's story didn't end with that lonely death. It lingered in the whispers of old mobsters, in the pages of FBI files, in the flicker of neon lights across the Vegas Strip she once helped dream into existence. She had loved and betrayed, risen and fallen, commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure. She was the woman who outplayed the most dangerous men in America and lived long enough to watch them all fall. Even in death, her legend refused to fade. Because Virginia Hill wasn't just another mob story. She was proof that power in the underworld didn't always wear a fedora or carry a gun. Sometimes it wore red lipstick and smiled while the world burned. The men may have built the empire, but she knew where all the bodies were buried. And that's why they called her the Queen of Secrets. By the time the flames of Las Vegas cooled and Bugsy Siegel's blood dried on the Beverly Hills floor, Virginia Hill's empire had already begun to crumble. She was still young, still beautiful, still dangerous, but the world around her was changing faster than she could adapt. The men who once bowed to her charm were either dead, imprisoned, or too cautious to be seen with her. The mob was cleaning house, and that meant wiping away anyone connected to old scandals. Virginia had always been good at survival. She packed her bags, slipped out of the country, and vanished into the folds of Europe like a shadow at sunset. From Switzerland to Paris to Rome, she reinvented herself again and again, sometimes a wealthy socialite, sometimes a businesswoman, always just far enough from danger to breathe. But she wasn't fooling anyone. The FBI knew exactly who she was, and they weren't done with her. In Washington, agents were piecing together a puzzle that seemed to have her fingerprints on every piece. They followed the money trails, the coded bank wires, the mysterious accounts that stretched across continents. Her name appeared in the ledgers of powerful men, in intercepted letters, and in whispered testimonies from informants trying to buy their freedom. To the Bureau, she wasn't just another gangster's girl. She was the missing link between the American mafia and its European operations. They called her the courier, the woman who moved cash, gold, and information through customs without ever being searched. The irony was that she rarely touched any of it herself. Virginia didn't need to. Her reputation did the work for her. She was the kind of woman customs officers hesitated to question, the kind who made even the boldest men second-guess their authority. But that power came with a ticking clock. When the Kefauver hearing summoned her back to the United States in 1951, she didn't go willingly. She went out of necessity. Her lawyers warned her that ignoring a Senate subpoena would make her a fugitive in every sense of the word. So she flew back dressed in fur and fire, determined to face them head-on. The hearings were a spectacle, televised for the first time in history, watched by millions. America saw her sit before the Senate like a movie star called to confession. But Virginia Hill didn't confess. She smirked. She flirted. She dodged every question with the grace of a woman who'd spent her whole life lying to men who thought they could read her. When asked how she'd made her fortune, she gave a line that would live forever in mafia folklore. "I just got gifts from my friends." The crowd laughed. The senators didn't. Behind closed doors, the FBI wasn't laughing either. They wanted her broken, exposed, stripped of the mystery that made her untouchable. But Virginia walked out of that hearing as untamed as ever, a woman who dared to mock the most powerful men in the country on live television. Yet beneath the confidence, she could feel the ground shifting. Her reputation, once her greatest weapon, had become her curse. Every headline, every photograph, every whispered rumor painted her as the woman who knew too much. And in the world she came from, that was the most dangerous thing anyone could say. She returned to Europe, but this time it wasn't an escape. It was exile. The mob didn't trust her, and the feds wouldn't leave her alone. She was caught between two worlds that wanted her silence, and she knew she couldn't please both. The money she'd once moved so easily became harder to access. The friends who had once offered her protection began to disappear. In Switzerland, she bought a villa, a beautiful home overlooking the mountains, surrounded by quiet. On the surface, it looked like retirement. But behind those closed doors, Virginia was unraveling. The glamour faded. The parties stopped. The laughter that once filled rooms was replaced by long nights of drinking and pacing the floor, haunted by ghosts of men who either loved her or died because of her. She'd always told herself she could outsmart anyone. But in those final years, even she began to wonder if that had ever been true. Maybe she'd been a pawn all along, used, admired, discarded. Maybe the men who called her queen had never intended to let her keep her crown. In 1954, European authorities, pressured by the United States, began investigating her finances. Swiss banks froze her accounts. Austrian officials questioned her movements. She tried to act unbothered, still showing up in furs and jewels, still flashing that defiant grin, but the truth was clear. The net was closing. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the hunted. Old mob contacts sent quiet warnings. Stop talking, keep moving, stay low. But it was too late. Her name was poison now. Even those who once adored her wanted distance. She carried too much history, too many secrets. Secrets that could still destroy men who sat in offices of power, wearing suits instead of fedoras. By the early 1960s, she was almost unrecognizable from the woman who once ruled nightclubs and whispered in the ears of gangsters. She'd aged beautifully, yes, but there was something hollow in her eyes, a tiredness that no amount of champagne could wash away. The laughter was gone, replaced by quiet suspicion. She no longer trusted anyone, least of all herself. Virginia tried to rebuild, opening a small business, dabbling in trade, but nothing stuck. Her name carried too much weight to be ordinary. She couldn't shake her past, and she couldn't relive it either. She was trapped between two versions of herself, the legend and the reality, and both were slipping away. There were whispers that she'd tried to cut deals, to sell what she knew in exchange for peace. If that's true, no one ever lived to hear the full story. What is known is that she grew increasingly paranoid, convinced someone was following her, watching her. Sometimes she'd call old friends in tears. Other times she'd boast that she still had power, that she still had secrets no one could touch. But power without allies is just a memory, and secrets lose their worth when no one's left to buy them. On a cold March morning in 1966, the world finally caught up to her. The maid found her body lying outside her villa in Salzburg, Austria, half buried in snow. The official report called it suicide, an overdose of sleeping pills. But even in death, Virginia refused to be simple. The press ran wild. Some said the mob had silenced her to protect the old bosses. Others believed she'd been despondent, her life unraveling in loneliness and regret. A few whispered that she'd staged her own death, that somewhere, somehow, the Queen of Secrets was still alive, watching the world from the shadows. What's undeniable is this: when Virginia Hill died, she took a chapter of American crime history with her. The real story, the full truth of her role, her betrayals, her loyalties, was buried beneath the snow that day, and perhaps that's exactly how she wanted it. She had spent her entire life weaving mystery into armor, turning half-truths into survival. Why should death be any different? In the end, her fall wasn't a crash. It was a slow, elegant descent. A woman who once danced with devils now lay silent, surrounded by the ghosts of men who never could decide if they had loved her or feared her more. The headlines called her the mob's mistress, the gangster's girl, the queen who fell. But for those who truly understood her story, Virginia Hill was something much more complicated. She was the embodiment of power in its most dangerous form, beauty mixed with knowledge, and the courage to use both. Her fall was inevitable, but her legend, that would never die. The story of Virginia Hill didn't end with the snow that covered her body in that lonely Austrian yard. It only changed shape. Legends rarely die cleanly. They echo, they mutate, and they find new life in the whispers of those who still remember. And Virginia's story, as tangled and glamorous as it was, refused to fade quietly into the archives of history. In the years that followed her death, her name continued to drift through the underworld like a ghost no one could bury. Every gangster who survived the old era had a version of her tale, each one different, each one laced with admiration or bitterness. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a woman who flew too close to the flames of power and got burned. To others, she was a martyr to her own ambition, a symbol of a world where charm could be sharper than a knife. Even the FBI couldn't leave her story alone. Decades after her death, agents still flipped through her files, thousands of pages of reports, testimonies, and coded notes. Her name appeared in connection with nearly every major mob figure of her generation: Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel. She was the thread that tied them together, a socialite, a courier, a confidant, a spy. But the Bureau never proved exactly what she'd done or how deep her influence went. They had theories, but no hard evidence. And maybe that's what made her so dangerous even in death. Virginia Hill had built her power on two things: mystery and memory. She understood, better than anyone, that knowledge was a currency that outlived cash. The men who had ruled the mob with guns and fists were gone, but she remained in the stories, the rumors, the photographs where she stood smiling beside kings of the underworld. She never needed to shoot anyone. She just had to remember what they'd done, and that, perhaps, was her greatest revenge. As the decades rolled on, Las Vegas became a glittering city of neon dreams, a monument to the very ambition that had driven her and Bugsy Siegel to chase fortune in the desert. The Flamingo still stood, rebuilt and reimagined, its pink lights glowing against the black Nevada sky. Tourists walked through the casino without realizing they were standing on ground soaked with betrayal and blood, built on a vision born from two lovers who believed they could outshine the mob itself. Somewhere, you can imagine Virginia's ghost watching from the sidelines, that sly smile curling on her lips. After all, the dream hadn't died. It had simply changed owners. In Hollywood, her name found new life, too. Films and books romanticized her story, painting her as the archetype of the mob mall: beautiful, cunning, doomed. But the real Virginia had always been more complex than that. The movies showed a woman trapped by love. The truth was, she was driven by hunger for power, for recognition, for freedom in a world that never gave women a fair chance at any of those things. And that's what made her unforgettable. In an age when women were supposed to stay quiet and look pretty, Virginia Hill built an empire of whispers. She could sit at a table full of killers and make them laugh, then walk away knowing more about their secrets than any man alive. She had been called manipulative, reckless, immoral, but she had also been called brilliant, fearless, and impossible to control. And maybe that's why she frightened them so much. The mob tolerated her as long as she was useful. But deep down, she was proof of something they didn't want to admit: that a woman could play their game and sometimes even play it better. Her story carried a strange kind of poetry. She had climbed from the dirt roads of Alabama to the penthouses of Hollywood, only to fall back into obscurity thousands of miles away. Yet in that journey, full of champagne, bullets, and betrayal, she had seen more of human nature than most ever would. She knew what power did to people. She knew how love could become a weapon. And she knew how quickly loyalty could turn to death. But she also understood something deeper: that legacy isn't written by the winners, it's written by the survivors. And for a long time, Virginia was the last one standing. When historians look back at the golden age of organized crime, her name sits in the margins of every major story. Not because she led an army or ordered hits, but because she influenced the men who did. She was the confidant in the corner of the photograph, the whisper behind the meeting, the messenger who carried deals across oceans. Without her, pieces of the puzzle don't fit. In a way, Virginia Hill became the embodiment of the American underworld itself: beautiful, corrupt, ambitious, and self-destructive. She wanted everything the world said she couldn't have, and she was willing to take it no matter the cost. That kind of fire burns fast, but it leaves a mark that doesn't fade. Even now, decades later, her story continues to resurface whenever people talk about power and the women who dared to seize it. In documentaries and podcasts, in novels and gangster lore, her name keeps returning like a refrain: the woman who knew too much, the queen who outlived her king, the beauty who carried secrets more dangerous than bullets. Some like to say that Virginia Hill's tragedy was that she couldn't escape the men around her, that she was a victim of their world. But maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the tragedy was that they couldn't escape her. She knew their sins, their lies, their ambitions, and she made them face it just by being there, by surviving longer than they expected her to, because in the end, she didn't need to win. She only needed to be remembered, and she was. Even the mob's new generation, men who had never met her, who only knew her from whispers, used her name with a kind of reverence. She had become a legend, not just for what she did, but for what no one could ever prove she'd done. That was her final victory. Virginia Hill once said, "I wasn't born to be poor. I wasn't born to be ordinary." And she was right. She died alone, yes, but her life had already transcended loneliness. It had become myth. The small-town girl who climbed into the underworld and made the world her stage until the lights went out. But somewhere in that darkness, you can still hear her voice, low and confident, laced with amusement. "They thought they could bury me. They forgot I taught them how." The desert wind still blows across the Vegas Strip, carrying faint echoes of the past. The neon lights shimmer, and if you listen closely, you might imagine the soft laugh of a woman who once ruled that world from the shadows. A woman who learned that secrets are more powerful than guns, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon of all is charm. Virginia Hill's story isn't just about crime. It's about ambition. It's about the price of survival in a world built for men but manipulated by a woman who refused to follow their rules. And maybe, just maybe, it's about us. The fascination we have with those who dare to chase their own destiny, no matter how dark the path becomes. So, when you walk past the bright lights of Las Vegas, or read another story about the mobsters who built it, remember her. Remember the woman who played their game and, for a brief shining moment, beat them at it. Because even now, her shadow lingers behind every story told about power, loyalty, and the cost of secrets. She was Virginia Hill, the mob's queen of secrets. And though her body is gone, her legend will never die. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history, where ambition meets betrayal and the echoes of power never truly fade.